This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Are markets efficient? Can you beat the market? And is the market the right price? This is the big issue. So much of today is grounded in that very, very simple sounding thought. Can the markets be beat? Of course, the markets can be beat. They have been beaten. There are decades and decades of track records to prove that you can do better than a passive index. Don't take my word for it. Do your homework. Now, I can't give you all of the homework today, all of the details, all of the pieces of evidence, but it's pretty easy if you go nibble around the edges of my world to find it. Whether it's on this podcast, my books, my website, you will find the information, you will find the data, the hardcore data that shows you that the market can be beat. Now, academically, the debate is great. Academically, you have the efficient market hypothesis and the behavioral school. The efficient market hypothesis says the markets can't be beat. Really, it has no great explanation for what happened in October of 2008. And the behavioral side of the equation says we're all just batshit crazy. We're not rational. I don't really think to a man, to a woman, you name the country, you name the age, who in their right mind really thinks we're rational? We're not. Now, this debate really doesn't have anything to do with making money, except to understand that trend following falls down on the side of the behavioral school. Behavioral economics, behavioral finance is illustrated through trend following trading. There's no better example. And look, I've had some of the brightest psychologists alive, brightest economists on my show to talk the behavioral way. But to this day, I still feel like I'm a lone voice, other than some of the very well-known traders, a lone voice in telling people, wow, you want a great example of letting your winners run and cutting your losers short? A great example of prospect theory? Trend following is it. It can't be beat in terms of an example. Find me a better example. It just doesn't exist. And since my podcast recently with Milton Friedman, the deceased Milton Friedman, since that podcast with me interviewing a dead man was so popular, today I want to reach out to some other very, very notable minds to let them explain to us, first, why the efficient market isn't so efficient. To let that unfold in a way where you can just kind of say, wow, this is not efficient. This just doesn't make any sense. My first guest today, Benoit Mandelbrot, a brilliant mathematician, a very wise man, no longer with us, but Professor, I would love for you to take a little bit of time and explain the efficient market hypothesis, explain, contrast, tear it apart, and tell us how and why we've all gone so wrong in the last 50 years.
Well, it started precisely in the year 1900 when a man named Bachelier, a French mathematician, presented his PhD dissertation called The Theory of Speculation. It's a remarkable piece of work which has had an enormous influence on theory of probability, enormous influence on what's called Brownian motion. But it was meant to be a theory of the way in which prices vary on markets of securities, of commodities, etc. As such, it had the most bizarre history. For 60 years, hardly anybody paid attention. 6 years later, when the computer became available, when people could really compare that theory with the data, the Bachelier theory suddenly became known, people became aware of it, and it began to rule the roost of those who are trying to model the variation of prices on the various exchanges. It posits markets work in an extremely simple fashion. As a matter of fact, it posits that markets are simpler than most physical phenomena, which is quite extraordinary, strong assumption. It posits that, in a certain sense, price goes up or down by a toss of a coin. If it's heads, the price goes up a little bit. If it's tails, it goes down a little bit, and just goes on like that endlessly. If you buy when the price is high, well, you lose. If you buy when price is low, you gain. But it's a model of extreme simplicity, which has, in certain sense, no parameters. If you scale the time appropriately and the value appropriately, it's the same theory for everything. And the chance of a sharp discontinuity is zero, because the process is assumed to be continuous. Price varies continuously by amounts, which of course in reality one doesn't have the continuous change because one has finite number of readings, but the theory says price varies continuously in continuous time. Well, Bachelier did not mention any experiments. Rumor is that he had done some experiments, but they are not reported. He has written about it in other papers of his, but one knows very little about him. He is a kind of mystery man in history of mathematics. He was presented PhD, got the doctorate, and disappeared for quite a while, until much later became professor of mathematics in the provinces. One does not know his motivation very well. While I was present at that time, I was close to that field. The reason was that the computer came, many things could be actually done, tested, data became available, and one was, in a certain sense, was a thirst for existing theories that might help. And here, miracle of miracles, in 1900, a complete theory was discovered, rediscovered in libraries, and one could have already a history. One could pick out of Bachelier all kinds of formulas which answered questions which people were asking themselves. That the tails in question, which are so completely impossible to draw because they are so thin, just a few events, the tails are extremely long. And that a record one looks at can seem to be just small steps up and down, and then one gigantic step. And the gigantic step itself is very often, in a certain sense, segregated. Market stops trading. Trading stops and then resumes at a different value. The question arises, do you take this big, enormous jump as part of the process, or do you say it's an act of God, depending upon different rules? If you say it's an act of God, it fits in Bachelier if you wish, because you have put all the big events under the carpet. My theory was based upon, first of all, an observation, which I made accidentally. I was coming to give a lecture at Harvard, as a matter of fact, and on the board of my host, I saw a certain drawing, which I was going to use in my lecture. So I asked my host, but how come you have on your blackboard the drawing I'm going to use? He says, I had no idea what you're going to say. But this thing refers to price change and refers to the distribution of one price change and next one, the joint distribution. It turns out, for technical reasons which I cannot explain here, that there are two different shapes of this distribution, one which goes this way, one which goes this way, and of course you can go in between. Everybody was assuming it was that way. What I saw in Blackboard was this way. In other words, the data were presented to me ideal fashion by pure chance. And I asked this chairman, who became my friend, to give me his cards. I went home to where I was working at IBM and analyzed this data and found that this distribution, as I had inferred from my own reasons, represented a situation in which the large price changes, even though few, were so large as to be the most important thing there is.
Professor, thank you for taking the time. I love that answer. I love the perspective, especially from people that are no longer with us. I love the perspective, the wisdom that just can't be counteracted. Building on Professor Mandelbrot's wisdom, I also wanted to interview today another guest, someone who really takes this to a foundational level. For example, let's just don't talk about theories. Let's talk about how we tear theories apart. Let's talk about how we break things down. How do we decide right and wrong? How do we use logic? For that, I'm fortunate today to have on my show Richard Feynman, the most famous physicist, perhaps, a man who was at the forefront of just about everything that took place in the 20th century, from the nuclear buildup to figuring out what went wrong with Challenger. He's seen it all. Professor, I want you to take my audience through today the scientific method, because we can have all these debates about the efficient market. We can talk about theory. But how does one go about even comparing and contrasting? There's a process, isn't there?
In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. It's therefore not unscientific to take a guess, although many people who are not in science think it is. For instance, I had a conversation about flying saucers some years ago with laymen. Because I'm scientific, I know all about flying saucers. So I said, I don't think there are flying saucers. So my antagonist said, is it impossible that there are flying saucers? Can you prove that it's impossible? I said, no, I can't prove it's impossible. It's just very unlikely. That, they say, you are very unscientific. If you can't prove it impossible, then how can you say it's likely, that it's unlikely? Well, that's the way, that is scientific. It is scientific only to say what's more likely and less likely, and not to be proving all the time possible and impossible. To define what I mean, I finally said to him, listen, I mean that from my knowledge of the world that I see around me, I think that it is much more likely that the reports of flying saucers are the result of the known irrational characteristics of terrestrial intelligence rather than the unknown rational efforts of extraterrestrial intelligence. It's just more likely, that's all. And it's a good guess. And we always try to guess the most likely explanation, keeping in the back of the mind the fact that if it doesn't work, then we must discuss the other possibilities. There was, for instance, for a while, a phenomenon called superconductivity. There still is the phenomenon, which is that metals conduct electricity without resistance at low temperatures, and it was not at first obvious that this was a consequence of the known laws with these particles, but it turns out that it has been thought through carefully enough, and it's seen, in fact, to be a consequence of known laws. There are other phenomena, such as extrasensory perception, which cannot be explained by this known knowledge of physics here, and it is interesting, however, that phenomenon has not been well established, and that we cannot guarantee that it's there. So if it could be demonstrated, of course that would prove that the physics is incomplete, and therefore it's extremely interesting to physicists, whether it's right or wrong, and many, many experiments exist which show it doesn't work. The same goes for astrological influences. If it were true that the stars could affect the day that it was good to go to the dentist, then, as in America we have that kind of astrology, then it would be wrong, the physics theory would be wrong, because there's no mechanism understandable in principle from these things that would make it go. And that's the reason that there's some skepticism among scientists with regard to those ideas. Now you see, of course, that with this method we can disprove any definite theory. If you have a definite theory, a real guess from which you can really compute consequences which could be compared to experiment, then in principle we can get rid of any theory. We can always prove any definite theory wrong. Notice, however, we never prove it right. Suppose that you invent a good guess, calculate the consequences, and discover that every consequence that you calculate agrees with experiment. The theory is then right? No, it is simply not proved wrong. Because in the future, there could be a wider range of experiments, you can compute a wider range of consequences, and you may discover then that the thing is wrong. That's why laws like Newton's laws for the motion of planets last such a long time. He guessed the law of gravitation, calculated all the kinds of consequences for the solar system and so on, compared them to experiment, and it took several hundred years before the slight error of the motion of Mercury was developed. During all that time, the theory had been failed to be proved wrong and could be taken to be temporarily right, but it can never be proved right because tomorrow's experiment may succeed in proving what you thought was right wrong. So we never are right, we can only be sure we're wrong. However, it's rather remarkable that we can last so long. I mean, have some idea which will last so long. I must also point out to you that you cannot prove a vague theory wrong. If the guess that you make is poorly expressed and rather vague, and the method that you use for figuring out the consequences is rather a little vague, you're not sure. I mean, you say, I think everything's because it's all due to Muggles, and Muggles do this and that more or less, so I can sort of explain how this works. Then you see that that theory is good because it can't be proved wrong. If the process of computing the consequences is indefinite, then with a little skill, any experimental result can be made to look like an expected consequence. You're probably familiar with that in other fields. For example, A hates his mother. The reason is, of course, because she didn't caress him or love him enough when he was a child. Actually, if you investigate, you find out that, as a matter of fact, he did love him very much and everything was all right. Well, then, it's because she was overindulgent when he was a child. So by having a vague theory, it's possible to get either result. Oh, wait. Now, the cure for this one is the following. It would be possible to say, if it were possible to state ahead of time how much love is not enough and how much love is overindulgent exactly, and then there would be a perfectly legitimate theory against which you can make tests. It is usually said when this is pointed out, how much love is and so on, oh, you're dealing with psychological matters, the things can't be defined so precisely. Yes, but then you can't claim to know anything about it. Now, I want to concentrate from now on, because I'm a theoretical physicist, I'm more delighted with this end of the problem, as to what goes, how do you make the guesses. Now, it's strictly, as I said before, not of any importance where the guess comes from. It's only important that it should agree with experiment, and that it should be definite as definite as possible. But you say, then, it's very simple. We've set up a machine, a great computing machine, which has a random wheel in it that makes a succession of guesses. And each time it guesses a hypothesis about how nature should work, computes immediately the consequences, and makes a comparison to a list of experimental results that it has at the other end. In other words, guessing is a dumb man's job. Actually, it's quite the opposite, and I will try to explain why. The first problem is how to start. You see, I'll start with all the known principles. But the principles that are all known are inconsistent with each other. So something has to be removed. So we get a lot of letters from people. We're always getting letters from people who are insisting that we ought to make holes in our guesses as follows. You see, you make a hole to make room for a new guess. Somebody says to you, people always say space is continuous, but how do you know when you get to a small enough dimension that there really are enough points in between? It isn't just a lot of dots separated by little distances. Or they say, you know those quantum mechanical amplitudes that you told me about, they're so complicated and absurd. What makes you think those are right? Maybe they aren't right. I get a lot of letters with such content, but I must say that such remarks are perfectly obvious and are perfectly clear to anybody who's working on this problem, and it doesn't do any good to point this out. The problem is not what might be wrong, but what might be substituted precisely in place of it. If you say anything precise, for example, in the case of a continuous space, suppose the precise proposition is that space really consists of a series of dots only, and the space between them doesn't mean anything, and the dots are in a cubic array. Then we can prove that immediately is wrong. That doesn't work. You see, the problem is not to change or to say something might be wrong, but to replace it by something, and that is not so easy. As soon as any real, definite idea is substituted, it becomes almost immediately apparent that it doesn't work. Secondly, there's an infinite number of possibilities of these simple types. It's something like this. You're sitting working very hard, you work for a long time trying to open a safe, and some Joe comes along who doesn't know anything about what you're doing or anything except that you're trying to open a safe. He says, you know, why don't you try the combination 10, 20, 30? Because you're busy, you're trying a lot of things. Maybe you already tried 10, 20, 30. Maybe you know that the middle number is already 32 and not 20. Maybe you know that, as a matter of fact, this is a 5-digit combination. There we are. So these letters don't do any good, and so please don't send me any letters trying to tell me how the thing is going to work. I read them to make sure that I haven't already thought of that. But it takes too long to answer them because they usually in the class try 10, 20, 30.
He is perhaps the one guest that I so wish I had a chance to sit down with. Feynman is so damn smart, knows so much. It just would have been amazing to either interview him, to learn from him. I mean, there's a mathematical IQ there that I can't begin to comprehend. Most people can't begin to comprehend. But it would have been a joy to have been immersed in his world, because he clearly could take the super complicated and reduce it down to words for us in the peasant class. I just love that. My last guest today is not dead. Believe it or not, he is not dead. No, all joking aside, he really isn't dead. Gerd Gigerenzer has appeared on my podcast twice. If you've not read his book, Risk Savvy, check it out. But today, through the magic of the internet, I'm going to have Gerd give a response to a very, very simple, at least to me, very simple sounding concept that I want him to elaborate on: heuristics. Because you see, once you know the market is not efficient, once you know that deep in your bones, once you know that trying to worry about whether it's the right price or not, who cares whether it's the right price? As trend following traders, we're not caught up in the right price. The right price is the price. That's it. This isn't about morality. Who cares? All we care about is the traded price, the market price. It's real. We can believe in it. And what's great about the traded price, it's a heuristic. A heuristic in the sense that we are taking a shortcut to make decisions. The shortcut is the price. Instead of trying to figure out all of the fundamental factors, the efficient market hypothesis, direction, we don't do any of that as trend following traders. We say, no, none of that. The only thing we know that's true is the price, and price is a heuristic. Professor Gigerenzer, explain to my audience a heuristic.
What is a heuristic? In essence, it's a rule of thumb. The important part is to understand that it is a strategy, a tool that helps you to survive in an uncertain world. Usually people think a heuristic is a second-class strategy which needs less effort, and therefore you lose some of the accuracy. This is called the accuracy-effort trade-off. Sounds very plausible, and it holds in a small world where everything is known. Yet that doesn't necessarily hold in an uncertain world where not everything is known. And we have shown that heuristics that ignore part of the information can actually make more accurate decisions in an uncertain world. And this is an important part, and it makes many people uneasy because their belief system doesn't allow for that. So the accuracy-effort trade-off is not generally true. It may be true in a small world, but not outside. In a real world, the goal will not be to find the optimal solution because it cannot be computed, but to make a good bet. And a good bet has to be robust. That means it is a bet about a world that may slightly change, and you don't know how it is going. And therefore, you need to have something that has a good chance to be robust, and that's one of the keys to that is to ignore part of the information. So this is the definition of a heuristic. A good heuristic is not just fast and frugal, but also, in the situation where it's applied, better than more complex strategies. So we study, a heuristic is based on evolved and learned core capacities, such as recognition memory, such as recall, tracking, the ability to imitate, and other figures. And that's why the heuristics are fast and quick. The examples are multiple. So a very simple heuristic is called the recognition heuristic. So assume you are in the TV show Who Will Become a Millionaire? And here's the $1 million question. Which city has more inhabitants? Detroit, Milwaukee. Time is ticking. What do you say? Now, Dane Goldstein and I have studied these situations, and the students at the University of Chicago, they got about 60% the correct answer, Detroit. Then we studied Germans, who know very little about Detroit, and some have never heard of Milwaukee. So, what percentage did this semi-ignorance get? 90% correct. So how can it be that people who know more actually get less, and those who know less actually get more correct? And this is a systematic effect. The answer is that in this case, the Germans can rely on a very simple heuristic, which is, I haven't heard of Milwaukee, I've heard of Detroit, so then I go with Detroit. The Americans can't use this heuristic because they knew too much. They've heard of both, and they know facts. And the facts give them the 10 percentage points above 50% which is chance. And the art to exploit one's own ignorance can give one much more. This example also shows that the heuristic doesn't work all the time. It only works if there is a correlation in the environment between the fact of having heard of something and the criterion one wants to know. And that's the case in sports, that's the case in businesses, that's the case in many instances, but not always. So one needs to know in what environment a heuristic is ecologically rational and where not. In the studies we have, they suggest that people, without even thinking, rely on the heuristic more often when it's rational, and not so often when there is no correlation out there.
I will have to reach out to Gerd soon again to have him onto my show. A very, very instructive voice in the field of decision-making, behavioral economics, trading. I'm working on a new edition of my book, Trend Following, and I'm right there looking at my decision to put Gerd Gigerenzer in my original editions. I'm giving myself a pat on the back for that. But you know, once you see something like the efficient market theory, once you see it clearly from, for example, an explanation from Manuel Mandelbrot, once you see clearly from my guest today, Richard Feynman, how to think about the scientific method, once you see clearly what a heuristic is, and again, Gerd Gigerenzer does a great job in illuminating heuristics. But all of that aside, it still comes down to, what do you want? What's your attitude? What steps are you going to take every damn day to make it happen? How will you behave? What is your drive, your self-drive, your interior motivation? one of my favorite audio clips of all time from the Eastern philosopher, Alan Watts. He asks the simple question that never gets old. What if money was no object? He's not saying money should not be an object. He's just saying, can you put yourself in the right frame of mind that your decision-making is not that of an intellectual cripple to where you can make sound decisions? Because when you're in that free place of mind, that open mind, that clear mind, that's when the great stuff happens. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.